Masechet Nedarim Daf Samech Aleph. The Mishnah that we began yesterday in the beginning of the 8th Perek was about someone who makes a vow for a certain time period, like he says today, or this year, or for 1 year. The maximum amount of time we saw in the Mishnah was for a Shemitah, what we call the Shavua, 7 years. But now we're going to ask, what about a Yovel? This is actually going to be a very important sugya about how to define a Yovel, whether it's 49 years or every 50 years. So we ask, Ibaya lehu, Amar yayin shani to'em Yovel mai, Shenat chamishim kilifne chamishim, or kilachad chamishim. If a person says, I prohibit myself from tasting wine for a Yovel, and even though the language here is a Yovel, which we were talking about yesterday, if he says a day or a year, and that was unclear, we're not dealing with that. It's clear that the person means for this Yovel. So he's standing sometime in the middle of the Yovel, in the 20th year, 30th year, doesn't matter, and he says, I'm not going to have wine for the rest of this Jubilee. Well, what does that mean? Is the 50th year, after you count 7 times 7, is that like what came before it? And throughout that 50th year, the person also would be prohibited. And according to this opinion, every Jubilee is a full 50 years. So 10 Jubilees would be 500 years. In other words, you start counting one after the 50th year. That's option number 1. Or is the 50th year considered starting already the next cycle? In other words, the 50th year is equal to the first year of the next Shemitah. To say that differently, every Jubilee is actually only 49 years, so 10 Jubilees would be 490 years. And that year, the 50th year, does double duty. It's the capstone of the previous 49 years, but also is year number 1 of the next Jubilee. Because it's year number 1 of the next cycle, therefore one would be permitted to have wine during that year. So that is the question. We'll try to answer it. Tashema, Tanya, Pelukta de Biyuda v'Rabanan. Actually, this will depend on a machloket between two Tanaim, as we'll see in this Baraita. It says that you should sanctify the 50th year. All right, good. So what does that mean? You sanctify the 50th year by counting towards it, and that is counted as the 50th year only. You do not count it as the 50th year and also the first year of the next cycle. You cannot use it for double duty. Rather, you count 7 times 7, 49 years, as 7 Shemitot. So that 49th year will be a Shemitah year, you can't work the land. And the next year will be the 50th year, which is the Yovel year, and also you cannot work the land, and that's at 50. Then that ends the Yovel, that's sanctified, and the year 51 is when you will start the next cycle. So, Yovel and Ole the Minyan Shavua, we learn from here that the Yovel does not count towards a Shemitah, does not do double duty. You're going to have the 7th year of the 7th cycle. It will be a Shemitah year. Then you'll have a Yovel, the 50th year. That Yovel does not count as year number 1 for the next one. Instead, the next year, 51 years later, that will be number 1 of the next Yovel cycle. So we see, according to Rabbanan, they certainly will count the 50th year as the continuation of what came before. And so if a person in the middle of the cycle says, I'm not going to have wine until for this Yovel, then they would be prohibited from having wine even throughout that 50th year. However, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Yovel Oleh Leminyan Shavua, Rabbi Yehuda disagrees, and he thinks that 50th year counts double duty. It's the 50th year of the previous cycle, and it's also year number 1 of the next cycle, which means altogether there's only 49 years for each cycle. And so 10 Yovdim would be 490. Therefore, because the Yovel counts as year number 1 for the next cycle, that year would not be included in the prohibition of his vow. We continue in the Baraita with a discussion between these two sages. Amru lo, the Rabbi Yehuda, the sages, the majority, tell Rabbi Yehuda, Harehu omer shesh shanim tizra sadecha, ven kan ela chamesh. Rabbi Yehuda, you have a problem, because the Torah says you should work your field for 6 years. Is permitted. Only on the Shemitah, then you're not allowed. But according to you, in the first Shemitah of the Yovel cycle, the first year is a Yovel year in which you cannot work the land, and therefore you can only work the land in years 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. That's only 5 years, because then the 7th year is Shemitah again. And so according to you, you're going to have a difficulty with this pasuk that says you always work the land for 6 years. And so according to us, that makes sense. We count 50 years, then we start another cycle with another year 1. And so it's always 6 years of work, followed by the Shemitah. Amar lehen, Yehuda has a good answer though. L'divrechem, harei omer ve'asat et ha'tevuah l'shlosh shanim, harei kan arba'ah. Yeah, but the pasuk also says that don't worry about not working the land during the Shemitah year. Hashem says, I'm going to guarantee that you'll have enough food for 3 years. Now, why do you need 3 years if you're not working the land for 1 year? Well, because in the 6th year, you need enough food that will last you during the 6th year, which is what you normally will eat during the 6th year. And you need extra that you can eat during the 7th year. And you're also going to need extra because at the beginning of the 8th year, you don't have anything that you planted during the 7th year that you'll be able to reap during the 8th year. So the Shemitah causes an interruption, not only for that own year, but also for the next year. Therefore, the 6th year crop has to yield you triple to take care of the 3rd, 4th, triple to take care of the 6th, 7th, and the 8th year. But here's Rabbi Yehuda's question. According to you, rabbis, actually, every Yovel, you're going to have a situation where you need it to last for 4 years, because you have in the last cycle of the Shemitah, you're going to have a Shemitah and then a Yovel, back-to-back years that you don't work the land. So the 6th year of that cycle, we'll have to grow enough for that 6th year, for that Shemitah, which is the 49th year, for the Yovel, which is the 50th year, and it's going to have to produce more to give you a head start on the 51st year, which is the first of the new cycle, in which you didn't plant anything. So you're going to need actual 4 years, and the Torah doesn't say that you'll get grain for 3 or 4 years. Ela ikalukma b'shar sheneh shavua, diliname ikalukma b'shar sheneh shavua. So Rabbi Yehuda says, I know how you're going to answer it. This pasuk is talking about most of the time, 6 out of 7 cycles. You only need for 3 years, and that's what the Torah is talking about. It's not talking about the unusual case. In that unusual case, once out of 7 years, yeah, then you'll get enough for 4 years. So I would say, that's what you'll have to say. I'll explain my pasuk the same way, the one that you challenged me with, and says for 6 years you work the land. Oh, but what about this is only 5? The Torah is talking about most years, right? In 6 out of 7 cycles, there are 6 years in which you can work the land. And during that one cycle, the Torah is not mentioning that. Although it would be true, according to my count of the Yehuda, in 1 out of the 7 cycles, it would only be 5 years of work. All right, so we leave that without a conclusion. And now we go back to the Mishnah that said, Ad ha-Pesach asur. If a person says, I'm not going to do any work until Pesach, then that means until Pesach starts, right? Erev Pesach would be the last day that he can't drink wine. The Mishnah went on and said, if a person says, Ad lifneh Pesach, I'm not going to drink wine until lifneh, whatever that means, that's ambiguous language and subject to a machloket. Rabbi Meir says, it still remains the beginning of Pesach, is when, that's what it means. Ad lifneh Pesach means before Pesach starts. Whereas Rabbi Yosef in the Mishnah says, no, you have to wait till the end of Pesach, right? And the lifneh, it's possible that it means lifanot, to when Pesach turns away, when it ends, until before, maybe you meant before the end of Pesach. This language is not clear. Okay, so that's machloket. So let's analyze the principle behind their machloket. Lemema de Rabbi Meir savar la me'ayel inish nafshe lesfeka, ve'Rabbi Yosef savar me'ayel inish nafshe lisfeka. The principle behind it seems to be that, according to Rabbi Meir, a person would not place himself in a position of uncertainty. In other words, when you first make the vow, he assumes that people are gonna, what they mean when they take the vow is the minimum possible interpretation, right? The one that is for sure, he means, right, it's for sure from now until Pesach starts, for sure that's included. And the person would not want any ambiguous case to be included, because a person doesn't want to put himself in an uncertain situation, right? No one is going to want to say, I'm prohibited for wine if, some galaxy exists at the edge of the universe. That's an uncertain thing. You don't want to put a vow on yourself that you don't know whether it applies or not. And so we assume that a person, if it's ambiguous, we assume that person means the minimum interpretation. And that's why in this case, when he says until before Pesach, he means until before Pesach starts, because that is unambiguous. Is Pesach included? That is not clear. So a person, we assume, does not have that in mind. Whereas Rabbi Yosef says, sometimes people aren't careful about what they say and what they think, and people sometimes do put themselves in positions of uncertainty. Right, I'll take a vow if that was a person who I thought it was, but the person walked away already, and so there's no way to check. So yeah, sometimes people do that. They do foolish things, and so Rabbi Yosef says then we have to give a maximum interpretation, since the words until lifnei Pesach can mean until before Pesach ends. So we have to assume the maximum interpretation that includes any doubt, that covers any doubt, because a person, maybe he did put himself into a position of uncertainty. All right, so that seems to be the principles behind their two opinions in our Mishnah. But we're going to show a contradiction from another Mishnah in Kiddushin. Or minhi. מי שיש לו שתי קטעי בנות משתי נשים, ואמר קידשתי את ביתי הגדולה, ואיני יודע אם גדולה שבגדולות, אם גדולה שבקטנות, אם קטנה שבגדולות, שהיא גדולה מן הגדולה שבקטנות, כולן אסורות דברי רבי מאיר, חוץ מן הקטנה שבקטנות. Okay, well here's Rabbi Meir's opinion. We're going to see Rabbi Yosef's opinion. There's an interesting case of a man who has two daughters from his first wife, and let's say she died, and then he has two more daughters with a second wife, right? The two daughters from the first wife are older than both of the daughters from the second wife. And now he does Kiddushin and he says, Biti HaGedolah, my oldest daughter. But then he doesn't remember what exactly he had in mind. Maybe he sent a messenger and said, "Don't go do Kiddushin for Biti HaGedolah," and he went and did something, but he's not around, and the guy doesn't remember what did he mean by Biti HaGedolah. It could have three possible valid interpretations. If maybe I meant the oldest of the oldest set. All right, the oldest of them all. That definitely could be. She was for sure going to be prohibited to marry someone else. Or maybe I meant the older of the younger set. Right? She's also the oldest because she's older than her sister. So that would be the third born. Or maybe I meant the younger of the older set. When I said B'tia Gedolah, I meant my daughter from the older set. And so that would be the second born, and it would be the one. So she could, because she's she's older than even the older of the younger ones, of the younger set. Because she's second, she is older than 3 and 4. So relatively, she is Hagedolah, even though she does have someone older than her. Well, since it has all these possible meanings, we have to assume that all of them are prohibited, and if any of them want to get married, they're going to have to get a get from that guy. according to the Rabbi Meir. And the only one who we know is okay is the younger of the younger set. The fourth born is for sure okay, because there's no possibility that Hagedolah is referring to her. Now that's the opinion of Rabbi Meir. So you see, this is actually a maximum interpretation, and we see that Rabbi Meir is following the principle that a person sometimes does put himself in a position of uncertainty, and since when he said that, he's not sure what he said. Well, we have to worry. Maybe he said something ambiguous, and maybe he meant an uncertain, an ambiguous interpretation of it, and so we have to take into account even that uncertainty and assume the maximum. However, Rabbi Yosef Omed, Kulan mutarot chutz min hagedolah shebegedolot. Rabbi Yosef disagrees, and he says all the other three are permitted to marry anyone they want. The only one who has a problem is daughter number one, the oldest of the older set. You see here that Rabbi Yosef is following the method of a person we assume does not put himself into a situation of uncertainty, and therefore, when he said, "I want my oldest daughter to be married," he told the guy, you can marry Biti Hagedolah. So he was marrying off and giving permission to daughter number one, because a person would not put himself into a situation of uncertainty. So therefore, he must have meant the certain case, which is only number one. That's Rabbi Yosef here. But now that contradicts, because Rabbi Yosef in our Mishnah was the one who went with the maximum interpretation that includes uncertainty. So how are we going to resolve this? Amar Rabbi Chanina bar Abdimi Amar Rav Mukhlefet Hashita. He's switch around the opinions in our Mishnah here in Nedarim. And so therefore Rabbi Yosef is consistent. Rabbi Yosef says that we do the minimum interpretation in both cases, and therefore it's actually Rabbi Yosef who says that the vow stops at the beginning of Pesach. And Rabbi Meir, he's the one that says you take the maximum interpretation, daughters 1, 2, and 3 are all prohibited, and in our Mishnah, he will say that you are prohibited from wine until the end of Pesach. And in fact, we have a Braita that backs us up. V'atanya ze hakelal, kol shezemano kavua ve'amar ad lifneh, Rabbi Meir omer ad sheyaseh, Rabbi Yosef omer ad sheyagia. Braita teaches that here's a general rule. Anytime you have something that has a fixed time period, right, has a particular date, we know the beginning and end of this event, and he says until before it, I will not have wine. Rabbi Meir says that means, well, that's ambiguous. So, you know what that means? Until the end, until that event finishes. And Rabbi Yosef says until it begins. So we see that this Baraita supports the answer that we should flip around the opinions in our Mishnah, and that way we have resolved the problem. Very good. Next Mishnah. Ad hakasir, ad habasir, ad hamasik, eno asur ela ad sheyagia. You know how the Eskimos have 50 words for snow? The Hebrew has a lot of words for harvesting. So kasir means harvesting grain. Basir is harvesting grapes. And masik is harvesting olives. Person says, I will be prohibited from drinking wine until the harvesting of the grain. Well, is that the beginning or the end? Eno asur ela ad sheyagia. The person is prohibited only until the beginning of that season. Zeh kilal. Kol shezemano kavua ve'amar ad sheyagia asur ad sheyagia. Amar ad sheyehe asur ad sheyehe. This is good. We have this klal, so we already introduced to a similar version of it here in the Braita. Anything that has a fixed date, a fixed beginning and a fixed end, and the person says until that event occurs, then he's going to be prohibited until it arrives, right at the beginning of it. If he says ad sheyeh until it is, right, until that event happens, then that's asur ad sheyaseh. That means he has to wait till the end of the event. And that would be the principle here. Ad hakasir means until the beginning of it. V'chol she'en zemano kavua ben amar ad sheyeh ben amar ad sheyagia eno asur ela ad sheyagia. However, that only applies if it's a fixed date. Then he says, well, if he says ad sheyeheh, that means till the event finishes, until the event happens, meaning it finishes happening. But if it's something that does not have a fixed time period, meaning we don't know how long it's going to take until it ends. A person says, I'm not going to have wine until I study calculus. Well, how long is it going to take you to study calculus, right? I don't know, maybe 10 years, maybe 20 years. And so in that case, whether he says the words until it, or whether he says until it arrives, is prohibited until it arrives. So when the person starts studying calculus, he's only prohibited from now until he starts studying calculus. We can't make a vow dependent on something that does not have a fixed end date, because then it's too open-ended. Now, the Mishnah continues and says, Ad hakayitz, ad sheyeh hakayitz, ad sheyatchilu ha'am lechnis bechalkatlot, ad sheyavor hakayitz, ad sheyakpilu hamaksuot. Person says, I'm not going to have wine until the kayitz. Kayitz actually has two meanings in Hebrew that are related. It could mean summer, as we say in modern Hebrew. It also means figs. It has the same meaning because in the late summer, that's when the figs were harvested. So if he says, I'm not going to have wine until the kayitz, or until it will be kayitz, then he is prohibited until the people begin bringing their baskets and filling them up with figs and bring it into their houses. Because that, in other words, the harvest is now well underway, and so that's what we assume he means. However, if he says until the kayitz is finished, well, when is it finished? Right? There's a lot of stages where you start it. The major activity was just when you start cutting. The major activity of collecting them and bringing into your house, but there's also always a little bit left to do out in the field. So if he says until kayitz is set aside, is over, well then he's prohibited until a later date, until they fold up the knives. Other people say the mats that they would put under the fig tree to collect. So in other words, when it's totally, you're finished cutting even the very last of the figs until it's totally over. And so it makes a difference. So adakayitz means until the major event of bringing the baskets in, until it's finished, means when you're really totally finished and you put away your tools into storage. Tana. Kalkala shamru kalkala shel te'anim velo kalkala shel anavim. A Braita says when we talk about here the kalkalot, the baskets, we're talking about baskets of figs, not of grapes. Since he said the kayitz, and kayitz means the summer when the major thing that's harvested is figs. So then you're prohibited until the fig baskets are brought into the house, and you don't have to worry about the olives, which are harvested a little bit later. Tanya, הנודר מפירות הקיץ אין אסור אלא בתאנים. רבן שמעון בן גמליאל אומר, ענבים בכלל תאנים. Another Braita says something similar, according to the Chachamim, is someone who says, I am prohibited from the fruits of kites. What are fruits of kites? Well, the major thing you're harvesting in the summer are the figs. So then he's prohibited only from eating figs. Instead of saying figs, he says the fruits of the summer. But in Hebrew, it's even a closer relationship because kites also means figs. So that's obvious he's talking about figs only, according to Tanakama. However, Rashbag says, no, grapes are also included because grapes are also beginning of the harvest is also in the summer, and so that is included. Okay, what's my Tamad Tanakama? What's their machloket about? Tanakama thinks Kasabar tenim mikasesan bida, anavim la mikasesan bida. He says they're fundamentally different, even if there's some overlap in the time. Figs you cut by hand. Grapes you don't pluck them by hand, right? But you use other tools. You shake the vines. And so these are fundamentally different, right? Kayitz, from the language of to cut, liktzotz. So these are different, does not include grapes. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel sabad anavim name ki mira dedan mikasesan bida. However, Rashbag says, no, it's not, although usually you're right, but that's not necessarily true. Grapes also, when they are ready, when they're ripe, also sometimes they are plucked by hand. And so therefore you can also refer to grapes as the perot of kayitz. There is overlap in the time period, and there's even overlap in the way that you pluck them off by hand, and therefore they would also be prohibited if someone says, I am prohibited from the fruits of kayitz. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.